Okay, he said, regarding your recent Easter Island video, I agree that controlling the birth rate of a population is necessary to sustain a civilization with a high quality of life, and for avoiding a constant state of war. However, comparing the former inhabitants of Easter Island to modern Europeans is apples versus oranges. In fact, Europeans have demonstrated an ability to self-regulate their populations to a sustainable level. And many on the alt-right and those in white nationalist circles could and have argued that Europeans are uniquely equipped to maintain a long-lasting, prosperous, and peaceful civilization because of this. This is in stark contrast to Africans, Arabs, Indians, and Asians. Following this rationale, one can logically state that European ethno-nationalism is a promising solution to many of the problems you laid out in your essay. So that was his response to me. Now, notice, before I get to my answer, notice that his claim here is based on a kind of white people are magic idea. That there's something very special about Europeans that somehow transcends biology and evolution. And that's to be expected because, as I pointed out in the Easter Island essay, every group's ideology views themselves, their perceived in-group, as special. So this is self-deception. Now, I'm not saying there isn't such a thing as racial differences, because obviously there are. Well, maybe it's not obvious to everyone, but it's fairly obvious to me. And I believe in European exceptionalism, that genes are at least part of the explanation for the Industrial Revolution. I wouldn't say that Europeans in general are necessarily more creative or innovative or whatever, but that in the European genome there were certain genes that were probably never in a majority of people, but were in sufficient quantities to enable a kind of civilizational advance, like the Industrial Revolution, that might not have happened in another population. So, first of all, I'm, as you know, or should know, a race realist. And also, I believe that, there was something exceptional about Europeans, because the evidence is there. That doesn't mean, however, that whatever genetic basis there was for the Industrial Revolution transcends evolution. And it doesn't mean that it's permanent, because race isn't permanent. Race is just a correlation of genes. So whatever magic there was in Europeans, I shouldn't say magic, whatever was exceptional about Europeans, it wasn't magic, and it doesn't transcend evolution. And therefore it cannot magically solve the problem of overpopulation, because that's built into the nature of life. Anyway, so here is my response. I said, Europeans have not demonstrated an ability to regulate their population. Low dysgenic fertility plus mass immigration is not sustainable regulation of population. There are some European subpopulations, such as the Amish, who have birth rates far above replacement. At their current rate of growth, the Amish would reach 8 billion in 300 years. Europeans have had multiple population explosions in the past, e.g. the Irish before the Great Famine, and many horrific wars. European populations were historically maintained by war, disease, and famine, the same as everywhere else. There is nothing magical about Europeans that exempts them from the nature of life. Polynesians had a stable, peaceful, prosperous society on Easter Island for 500 years, until their population exceeded the limits of the environment. So that was my reply. And he didn't really address most of what I said there, but he said this. Europeans first reduced their fertility then mass immigration was imposed to satisfy the disastrous, endless growth economy being practiced in the West. This does still leave us with the problem of dysgenic breeding patterns, though. But it just so happens the alt-right and white nationalists offer a solution for this, which is no longer encouraging and enabling intelligent women to pursue higher education and compete with men in the workforce. This should help make breeding among Europeans more eugenic. So let me just go over this now, and then I'll read my response that I made in this discussion. And of course this back and forth isn't entirely fair, because he's not here to have a discussion. In fact, I'll invite him to have one if he wants, to have a real-time discussion that I'll record and put up. If he's interested, I'll just ask him. Anyway, but I'm just putting this out there because I'm making my arguments, right? So, he didn't address the point that Europeans have not displayed this magical property of regulating their population in the past. He says Europeans first reduced their fertility, so he gives Europeans credit for reducing their fertility, as if this was something that Europeans did, right? It was, a direct consequence of their specialness. And then he says mass immigration was imposed. I suppose, meaning that it was imposed by somebody else. Probably the Jews. And then he says to satisfy the disastrous endless growth economy being practiced in the West. Well, yeah, we have an endless growth economy. That is something that happened because we've had growth for hundreds of years and we've gotten used to it. So, I just wanted to point out the rhetoric here. The way, on the one hand, the Europeans are responsible for reducing their fertility. So they have the agency to reduce their fertility, supposedly, I guess, for the greater good. And that wasn't a trick, that wasn't imposed on them, but mass immigration was imposed on them, right? And this is a very common rhetorical trick to portray certain things as being chosen and others as being imposed. But you have to make Europeans either fully responsible for what they have done in their societies, or make them completely irresponsible and say that they had nothing to do with any of it. Right? You can't just cherry pick the things you want to give Europeans credit for, and then everything that you view as negative then becomes the fault of the Jews or somebody else. Let me just read what I said here. Well, actually, maybe I'll just expand on this a bit. So he says then, that this leaves us with the problem of dysgenic breeding patterns. Yes, it does. But it also leaves us with the problem of subreplacement fertility that would cause the extinction of Europeans. See, the problem is not high fertility or low fertility. The problem is a fertility that is not being regulated in a way that is sustainable. It's not like low fertility is good and high fertility is bad. The problem we have is that the mechanisms that regulate population in nature require premature death. And also, they are the mechanism of selection. So anybody who, chooses low fertility voluntarily is choosing, they're selecting against their genes. So genes that lead you to make that sort of choice are selected against. So that's something that most people just can't grasp. That there is no fixed human nature, and there is no fixed European nature. We are always being selected in every generation for whatever generates the most offspring that survive to adulthood. Or in other words, whatever does the best job of reproduction. We're always being selected to reproduce. So Europeans choosing not to reproduce is not a feature. It's not some sort of magical, wonderful thing about Europeans. It's a bug that's going to get selected out of the population. Anyway, then he says alt-right white nationalists offer a solution, which is no longer encouraging and enabling intelligent women to pursue higher education, blah, blah, blah. And that should help with the dysgenics. Well, it might help, but it doesn't address the fundamental problem that you can go on welfare and have 8 kids, whether you're black or white or whatever. So that will be selected for. And if we put up a wall around the white population and we had exclusively white societies, but we still had the welfare state and we still subsidize people to reproduce, then we're selecting for people who simply reproduce. We might get white welfare moms instead of black welfare moms, and the process might take a little bit longer, but the result would be the same. Dysgenic. So I replied, there is nothing magic about Europeans. Europeans are not the only people to lower their fertility in modern times. That is an effect of modernity, and it will be eliminated by natural selection. Low fertility is unstable unless it is socially imposed by force. I've talked about these things quite a bit on my blog and in videos. I don't think he's read much of my other stuff or listened to it, because I've talked about this quite a bit. Then he says, I agree, low fertility is an effect of modernity, but that doesn't tell us much. Well, maybe not, but I have talked about this a lot. Then he says, what exactly is it about modernity that lowers fertility? I'll say it again, the liberation of women. If women are not subjugated to their fathers and husbands, birth rates plummet. One can have modernity and replacement level fertility rates as long as women are placed beneath men. And we can even go a step further by limiting the fertility of the lower classes while encouraging births among the higher classes. These are very popular ideas on the alt-right, and I think that most Europeans would go along with it if we were in charge. Regarding European magic, I shed a single tear at your disbelief in it. And I responded, so you agree that eugenic population control of some sort is necessary, and you agree that white people are not magic, meaning that they require regulation like everyone else. You accept the point I have made, but then you attach it to white nationalism. There is no logical connection between those things, however. White nationalism does not imply eugenic population control, and it isn't necessary for it either. So, the point I'm making here is that these things are separate. You can have white nationalism without eugenic population control, and you can have eugenic population control without white nationalism. It doesn't have to be racial in any way. I mean, the effects might be racial to some extent, but the policy does not have to be racial in any way. It just has to be eugenic, and it has to control the population. That's it, right? Then I said, the only connection is that both are heretical and reject humanism/egalitarianism. Stabilizing modernity requires more than placing women below men. It requires eugenic population control. Placing women below men won't necessarily accomplish that, and it isn't the straightest path to that objective. It is not just feminism that lowered fertility. It is also the birth control pill. And low fertility is not the problem. The problem is that fertility and immigration are mostly dysgenic now. Right? So, I mean, again, it's not like low fertility needs to be raised or... what we need to do is make fertility or make reproduction conditional on something. The way nature works is that you reproduce until there's a very big struggle for existence in which most offspring die. Or in other words, in which the average number of surviving offspring is 2 for every reproductive strategy. Not just for humans, but for every species. But the number of offspring generated is usually much, much greater than 2. And that's a stable state. That's the only time you get stability in nature is when you have a high rate of death, premature death. So if you want to avoid that, the only thing you can do, and here I'm talking in the long run, I'm not talking about tomorrow or next week or the next 10 years, but maybe the next 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 years, the only thing you can do to have stability without a high premature death rate is to make reproduction conditional on something so that the struggle for existence is played out in some other aspect of life other than just survival. So that instead of people basically fighting for their children's lives, they're competing economically for, say, reproductive permits, for the license to reproduce. There are various ways of doing it, but the fundamental point is you have to make reproduction conditional and then limit fertility using birth control or, other methods, maybe even abortion in certain cases, to prevent people from cheating on the scheme. Right? You have to force them to obey the rules of the game, and you don't let reproduction be an unconditional right. So just putting women under men doesn't do that. It wouldn't stop somebody from having a whole bunch of kids and going on welfare. Getting rid of welfare would do that. But then you might end up with all these kids who are starving in the streets and, stealing or just, running around causing trouble because they're starving and then dying. And then you have people who find it hard to accept the death of young children. And I'd be one of those emotionally. I'd find it hard to, watch kids starving to death in the streets. So what he's proposing here isn't a solution. He's not really proposing anything except we get rid of feminism and we have white nationalism. And that doesn't work. That's not a solution. Okay, it might be very ideologically convenient because it gives people an in-group, which is Europeans, and it gives them a number of out-groups that they can hate, which people find emotionally satisfying. Jews, Muslims, blacks, and so on. But it doesn't solve our problems as a species or as a race or as a civilization. It isn't actually a solution. To solve our problems, we have to be rational. We have to be honest. And we have to think. And the thinking is not going to be emotionally satisfying. It's not going to tell us that we're wonderful and the solution is like a Walt Disney movie. The good guys just have to win and then everybody lives happily ever after. Because that's not how nature works. That's not reality. That's a fantasy.